My name's Dr. Gill Brown. I am a chartered psychologist. I work as head of psychology at the University of Bolton, where we've got a number of undergraduate and postgraduate programs. So I work across lots and lots of different types of psychology modules. But my specialism is in forensic psychology. So I used to work in prison service, and I worked at a couple of different prison services. One was in Yorkshire, and then another one was back in Greater Manchester. They were male prisons. And I suppose I was quite shocked when I went in, because I don't know about you, but my only experience was watching a lot of the TV crime dramas. And when I really went in, and I went in quite early, I was about 22 straight after my degree. It was a real learning curve, and some of the best years of my life, really, in terms of development, personally and professionally. So I thought it would be really useful just to give you an overview of what a psychologist might do in the prison service, because it is a very, very flexible, varied job. And psychologists might work in lots of different forensic services. So they might work, for example, in a secure hospital. They might work with the police. They might work with the courts or victim services. But one of the biggest employers of forensic psychologists is still the prison service. So really, in terms of a prison psychologist, there's two real functions, and there's four areas of competencies that a psychologist needs to meet in terms of their training. So people often ask me, was it like you were seeing people like Hannibal Lecter? I don't know if anyone's seen Silence of the Lambs. It's a great film if you haven't. And it almost was, but it really wasn't at the same time. So one of the main functions of my role was to act as a treatment manager for offending behaviour programmes. Now, treatment as a psychologist doesn't mean medication or that kind of treatment. It's very much about the talking therapies type side. And in the prison service, we do a lot of offending behaviour group work. So I might be leading a group, say, of 10 individuals, and we will be working on things that are relevant to that group. So they have a number of offending behaviour programs, which are all driven by psychological principles. So I might be working with a group of violent offenders, might be working with a group of sexual offenders. It could be people that have been charged for acquisitive crimes, so different types of theft or burglary. And even with the different types of offences, there are lots and lots of different reasons why people might commit a crime. So one of the psychologist's role is really to use the in-depth psychological knowledge and research and all that science that sits behind psychology to help us understand a bit more about human mind and behaviour, and why people sometimes break their own rules. Because one of the questions I often get is, well, aren't people just bad? Can you help people? And I think the philosophy of the prison service is very much we need to support people in putting positive change into their lives. So that's something I really believe, that people can change. It doesn't necessarily mean that everybody will change, but sometimes it's just about looking at what we call the function behind what they did. So often offenders have the same values, the same core thoughts and things that are important to them as non-offenders do. But the difference is something in their lives, or often a large number of factors in their lives, they come together and they allow that person to break their own rules so that they end up being deviant against the law and committing crimes. So one of the main jobs in this treatment is to look at what factors are at play that have led to that individual committing crime. Now, it might be things like alcohol or drugs. It could be linked to mental illness, but often it can be linked to their values, to their core thoughts, their beliefs, their justifications for why it's okay to do certain things in certain situations. And then, of course, there's lots of other factors that can happen in people's lives. So we look at things like early childhood. So you've got the developmental psychologist, you've got a lot of theories around attachment. It may be that people have experienced trauma or they've witnessed something. It may be because all the people around them in the particular area they live are committing crime. So we've got the social psychology there. So what we do is we try and understand the different factors and how they come to play in that individual's what we call chain of offending. And then once we've got a clearer picture of that, we can put some support in place to work on it. Now, this might be very challenging for the offenders. So a lot of it is really exploring the harm that they've done. It's exploring their thoughts and values that allowed them to behave in that way. And it's also giving them support and tools so that if they're in similar situations in the future, they've got alternatives to go down. So as part of my job, I was the treatment manager. So that meant I ran some of the offending behaviour programmes and had a team of psychologists. And it was really, really rewarding work because I could put into practice all that psychology I'd learned in the classroom. So by that stage, I'd done my A-level psychology, I'd done my degree, and I was just doing my master's because I was at an earlier stage of training. But as I progressed through my master's and developed in my practice, then I got to take on much more psychological work, and I became a chartered psychologist. So one of the other key roles that I had, it wasn't just about supporting the offenders and allowing positive change, it was also about protecting the public. And that's another key aim of the prison service. So people go into prison because they're removed from society and they are keeping the general public safe. So I had a lot of work to do with life sentence prisoners. So these are offenders that have done the worst crimes. So a lot of my life sentence prisoners had committed murders or multiple murders or really heinous sexual offences or repetitive, serious, violent offences. So this would warrant a life sentence. Now, that doesn't mean that the person spends their life in prison necessarily. They would get a set number of years in which they have to spend in years. So it might be 10 years, for example. And then after that, they would need to show that they had reduced their risk. So this is also where psychologists come in and they use all the psychological evidence, their understanding of treatment and risk factors and the reduction of them. And what I would do is I would write reports, usually every 2 to 3 years for my life sentence offenders, and I would comment on their risk. And they would go to the judge, and that would be used to help make the decision about whether an offender may be suitable either for release or perhaps to go back down a level of category in terms of their prisons, because you've probably seen on the news and some crime programs and things, some prisons are really high secure. So locally, we've got HMP Manchester, which is what we call a category A prison. But they go right down to a D prison. So in Kirkham in Lancashire, we've got a category D, and that's what's called an open prison. So people are in prison, but they have more flexibility sometimes to work outside or even go for home visits. It's that transition back to the community. So in terms of the risk assessment, that was really, really interesting work. So I'd get to spend quite a long time with the offenders on one-to-one. I'd be reading all their files. And remember, they might have been in for 10 years. So there was stacks and stacks and stacks of paperwork from the courts, from police, from witnesses, from anything they'd done during their prison sentence. And then I would get to interview the offender. And this could be over a few days. It could be quite in-depth interviews to really focus on the psychological risk factors. So what their current thinking is, what their attitudes are, what their behaviours are, how they have embraced or not the intervention work. Have they done some courses, for example, but they've just sat there and they've not fully engaged or made any progress in actually addressing what they needed to? So the risk assessment work, it was, very daunting. There's a big responsibility because it would never be my decision. It would always ultimately go right up to the government level. However, I was making a significant contribution to that decision. and I would need to present my evidence in front of the judge and have a robust rationale for that. So we've got the treatment side, we've got the risk assessment in terms of keeping people safe from the outside and making sure that while offenders are at high risk of violent or serious offending, they are retained in prison. But then also what psychologists do, they're really well placed to do consultancy work. So sometimes the governor would ask me to do a piece of work if there was a specific problem. So, for example, there was a real problem with men self-harming and suicide attempts. So when there's a really significant issue or numbers are showing a really negative trend, it's really important to try and address what's happening and also to put in some preventative measures and know where those measures should be and how they should be administered. So there was a real problem with mental health. There was also a real problem with, when I was there, with bullying on the wings. And again, this is where the social psychology comes in. So how people responded in advance of other people, how the groups came. Now, where I worked, it was in between Manchester and Liverpool. So there was notorious gangs from Liverpool and notorious gangs from Manchester. And again, it was a real important management issue that these were managed appropriately across the prison wings, but also within the individual wings. So I got to work on some really, really interesting projects. Psychologists also got to do things like hostage negotiation. So that could be an offender that has got another offender in their cell, or it could be that they are using a staff member, either an officer or civilian staff member, as a hostage. We got trained in all kinds of techniques to try and work with that and de-escalate potential life-threatening situations. And we even got to look at things like working on heights, because you've probably seen again on the TV with the prisons, they have different levels and they have the wire netting across them, as you'll have seen. So again, if somebody gets up over one edge and jumps down, it's really difficult to do those negotiation techniques. So again, there's a lot of psychological skills there, because it's all about that communication. It's all about understanding how to solve the problem and to get a really strong resolution for everybody, because ultimately we don't want anybody to come to any harm at all in these really, really challenging situations. So the consultancy work was really, really interesting. And then linked in with that, because psychology is just shrouded in evidence and research, I was able to use my research methods understanding to do projects and pull together data and trends and support the prison in that way, and use that to deliver training. So sometimes to address key problems, but sometimes it was psychological training to officers, perhaps who felt less comfortable with certain things or with certain health conditions or with how to engage an offender in a certain thing. So it really, really was a varied job, which I absolutely loved. And I spent a number of years doing it. And it's something that I look back really, really fondly on. But since I came out of the prison service, I went and worked in mental health services. So again, I was able to use all my experience, and I was working with people that had been sectioned and had a hospital admission. So I was looking at psychological interventions to try and reduce them going back into hospital. And then from then I developed my academic career. So gradually I did a little bit of teaching, and I found that I really, really enjoyed sharing my learning and the practical application with students. And gradually my practice reduced and my academic side increased, where I find myself now full-time at the university. So I think that's been about 15 minutes from me, just with a real broad overview. But as I said, I think the real important bit from today will hopefully be for you to have the chance to ask me anything you want to about psychology or the prisons, and I can share some examples and experience with you.
Okay, one of my students, Gill, has asked, what did you find the most challenging in your role?
That's a great question. I think it was when I was working with offenders that or victims from the offenders that reminded me of somebody I knew. So people often think the worst people to work with will be the worst crimes, and not at all. I think for me it was challenging initially to depersonalize some of the offences that you're working with. And obviously you are dealing with people and you're dealing with supporting people and you're using your psychological skills. But at the same time, there has to be a professional balance where when I go home, I'm not really upset, or I'm not just constantly thinking about particular cases or victims. So I think initially the challenge for me was to find that professional balance. And rather than getting really emotionally involved in any case I was working with, it was to learn techniques to look at, well, what's the factors? What's the criminogenic needs? How is this going to be targeted? So it was almost removing some of the emotional ties with it. So I think that's how I'd answer that one.
Wendy, do you want any of yours got a question? We'll take it in turns.
Yeah, one of my students has asked, did you witness any outbursts from any of the prisoners?
Oh, good question. Not directly. There were certain offenders that did make me feel very uneasy, and what you learn to do when you're working with people is look for what we call triggers. So it may be that somebody sat there still and quite quiet, but sometimes you can feel it in your gut, and that's what my supervisor said. If you ever just don't feel particularly safe, there's usually a good reason for that. And sometimes you can't necessarily say what it is, but it's usually because you're picking up on some of these really tiny, minute triggers. So there were circumstances where I felt there could have been outbursts and there was a start of the escalation, but I never saw that myself. But I did experience it being in the prison. And the great thing is security is, as you would expect, so tight. So in every single entrance, in every room, there is a button. They're every few meters along in the actual prison wings. So if anybody pushed one of these big green buttons, there would probably be about 20 officers with you in seconds. So that always felt really, really kind of nice to know. And I never needed to do that at all. But one of my friends who was a prison officer, they did get assaulted on 2 occasions. They had a very large bin thrown at them, and an offender had a weapon where they'd used a toothbrush handle and they'd got a CD somehow, and they'd smashed up the CD, so it was really sharp. So that did happen to somebody I knew, but the reality is it was really, really few and far between in terms of serious incidents. And as psychologists, what we would do is we would try and establish, why did the person behave in that way? And the question was about these emotional outbursts. One of the biggest deficits that particularly violent offenders have is difficulties with controlling their emotions. So if you were really stressed out or upset, you would have your own coping techniques. You might go for a run, you might speak to your friends, you might just take a few minutes out. Because of this impulsivity and an inability to deal with emotions, it would often come out instantly in a violent form to release the emotional tension. So a really good question there. Thank you.
Okay, I have another question, Gill. It's,
Great.
have you ever worked with anyone who's criminally insane? And what criteria would someone have to meet to be classed as criminally insane?
Again, really fantastic questions, and we actually cover this a little bit on my degree course. It's quite a difficult one to answer quickly, but I'll do my very best. So what we talk about is mentally disordered offenders, and there's different types of mental capacity that we're looking at. So it might be that somebody can't stand trial, for example. So if we go back to the courtroom, because they don't have the mental capacity to understand the counts against them and to actually make a plea. So there's the time of trial, but then there's also the time of the offence. So if somebody was mentally ill at the time of the offence and that was linked to their actual offence there and then, again, that's something that would be considered by the courts and potentially in terms of the disposal option. And the disposal option is that bit when been to the court, it's where is that person best treated. So if somebody was a mentally disordered offender, and we're not talking about an offender with mental illness, that's very different because it's estimated that up to about 80% of offenders have mental illness, but we're talking about this high level mental capacity. They would likely go to, rather than a prison, somewhere like Ashworth Hospital. That's a high secure hospital. It's governed by the NHS, and whilst it's set up a bit like a prison in terms of the security is immense and people cannot get out, it's also got a focus on the clinical care to support somebody in being able to hopefully go back to a prison setting, or in the case of if they weren't fit to trial, they might go there until they were fit to face trial against what they'd done. So in answer to that, I've worked with people that haven't been mentally disordered in terms of their offending or the times of their trial. However, since being in prison, their mental health has deteriorated significantly, that they can't be managed in the prison, and for their own safety and safety of other offenders and staff, they have had to have a progressive transfer back into a secure hospital to get treatment. So then they would then become what would be classed almost as a mentally disordered offender because their mental illness is so significant. So really here we're usually talking about the extreme types of mental illness, which might be something like a significant case of schizophrenia, which is characterized by hallucinations and delusions. So if somebody's suffering from those, they might think everyone on the wing is trying to kill them, or there's a conspiracy. They might be trying to harm themselves, but significantly so that their life is at risk. So in those cases, it may be there's a significant need for close observations, for significant medications and higher level of treatment that can be offered in the prison. So just in short, I have worked with people that have then needed that transition to a secure hospital, but a mentally disordered offender wouldn't usually be put straight into prison. They would usually be supported in a more appropriate environment. So if anyone's interested, have a look at Ashworth Hospital and all the facilities that are there. For example, that's where Ian Brady went. Some of you will have heard of Ian Brady. And in Ashworth Hospital, it's a bit different. So, for example, in a prison, if an offender wants to go on hunger strike, well, that's their choice. They're in the prison. If they're in a secure hospital under the Mental Health Act, then they can be forced to have medication or they can be forced to eat. So it's a little bit different in terms of the right and the legality of it as well in a mental health high secure hospital.
Wendy, have you got another question?
Yeah, I've got another one here. How did you come across the job of a psychological assistant in the prison?
Really good question. I just did internet searches. So there's lots of places you can have a look. If you're interested in psychology jobs, you would need to have your psychology accredited degree to be able to apply for one. But there's a prison service website. They often have jobs attached to it. However, there are private prisons now, and there are companies that operate within the private prisons that become the employers. You can look on a general job search. So any psychological assistance job should be on something like Indeed. So have a look at that website and just Google search. That's all I did, and it just catches up any particular jobs. Now, again, it depends when you're at that stage where you might be applying. If you're in a position, and I know not everyone is, to move areas, that just gives you a little bit more chance. Because jobs do come up, but they are competitive. So if you've got the opportunity to move areas to get your first kind of foot on the ladder, that's always recommended. So I did that. I moved just for the job, and I stayed there about a year or so, and then I got my transfer back to the Northwest so I could come back home, you know, near family and friends. So keep an eye on the website. But there's also jobs that are very, very similar to the psychological assistant jobs, but they're in prisons and they're called intervention facilitators. So again, if you just Google prison intervention facilitator, you will get an idea of the kind of jobs and what is needed for those jobs and where they're cropping up. So again, that would just mean you can deliver one of these offending behaviour programs. You would get full training and you'd be in there. It could be a substance abuse program, it could be emotional related, it could be related to violence or sexual offending, but you would usually work on a range of programs depending what was delivered in the place that you're working. Okay.
Gill, we've just got a question about how much studying and how much training, how long does it take to become a prison psychologist?
Great question. So, as I said, you would need to get your accredited psychology degree, and that's accredited by the British Psychological Society. So you can go on their website and find all the BPS registered courses. You would also be required to do a master's degree as part of your next stage of training. So that could be a master's in forensic psychology, a master's in investigative. There's one locally that looks at forensic and mental health. So long as it's a master's level and it's got forensic and it's accredited by the BPS, you would need to do that. Now, you can often do that while you're working. And again, it depends what opportunities are available to you, but you do need to have your masters. And then following your masters, there's a minimum of 2 years supervised practice as a trainee. So that means you're almost doing the job as a psychologist. However, you're under close supervision of a chartered or senior psychologist, a registered psychologist, and any reports you write or any treatment that you do, they will be meeting with you and it will be them that has to sign anything off. So you're almost doing the job, but you've got your hand held very closely by somebody that's ultimately responsible for you. And during that time, you show your competence in the main areas I've talked about around risk, around treatment and consultancy and research, and then you're qualified. That said, there is an alternative route where if you got in a position, for example, as a psychological assistant in the prison service, and you got your masters while you were there, there is a 3-year doctorate course now. So you come out of that as a doctor, not a medical doctor, but you get to call yourself doctor because it's the academic doctoral qualification. And during that, you're at a university, you're learning, but you're also doing your practice work at your place of employment as well. And you know then guaranteed in 3 years, if you do all your work and meet your competencies, you are chartered. So it's not an immediate chartered or registered psychologist, because then you need to apply for registration with the HCPC. However, you're working as you go, so you're getting paid, you're in jobs, whether you're as a psych assistant or intervention facilitator, and you're doing your training as well. So I think it's the best of both worlds, and it will take a few years, but you can definitely get there with hard work and commitment.
Wendy, have you got any other questions?
Yeah, I'll just do one more. Did working with such violent criminals affect your day-to-day life?
Oh, a really good question. I wouldn't say in a negative way at all. Possibly when I very first started, and I was young, I was about just coming up 22, possibly even still 21. I was quite fresh out of university. And, you know, that initial jump in was quite difficult and it felt quite scary because it was unknown. However, I think working with lots of people, it absolutely challenged a lot of my assumptions. It challenged things that I'd seen on the TV or films. And what I realised is most people I was working with were very similar to me, really, or people I knew. And the complexities behind their lives and all these factors that came together, it helped me really understand how people can become deviant in terms of breaking the rules. And I think beyond that, it just made me a little bit more cautious, perhaps, when I was out and about, and more vigilant if I could see something escalating. For example, if I was in Manchester shopping and I saw an altercation or something. So I don't think it had any negative effects. I think it had a lot of positive effects on me, how I see the world. And that's continued to stay with me now. And we all, and as a psychologist, we learn that we do stereotype people. We are judgmental, we make attributions, we have biases, but it's helped me challenge an awful lot of those, and think in a slightly different way. So for me, it was a real big personal development.
That's great. Thanks very much, Gill.
No problem. I think we're bang on time, aren't we? Is
Yeah,
that
I think so?
Yeah. Brilliant. If anybody does have any other questions and they want to get in touch with me, I'm very happy for my email address to be passed on. It's no problem at all. If anybody did want to get in touch, or if you wanted me to come and deliver another session at all to any students, that's fine.
Oh, that's great. Thanks very much, Gill.
No problem. I'll leave you to it. I hope you enjoy the rest of the
Thanks
day.
so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.